Buyani, welcome to studio and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
When we talk about leadership, there's different ideas and notions of what we mean by leadership.
Absolutely.
As someone that works in the field, what is your interpretation of what leadership should be?
Basically two things for me. Leadership has to do with movement. There has got to be a movement that the person who's providing leadership gives. So there's got to be movement. There's got to be a destination we're going to. Second is that there's got to be a dream that you can take people alongside with you too. When those two things are in place, you are going to be able to lead.
In your view, both at corporate and national level, do we have the requisite leadership to take us where we want to go to?
Well, let's look into it. And I would like to be able to say what we're looking for is leadership that is credible. And to a large extent, where we struggle to be able to find leadership is when we do not have people who have the credibility and the willingness for others to be able to follow them. So again, when you say there's movement, there's got to be somebody who knows where they're taking people to, and they've got to have the credibility to have others want to follow them. What tends to be happening in many organizations, and these are formations and non-formal formations, as it were, is that we've got more of how to manage things, that is, somebody else has set up what needs to be done, than we do have people who can tell us what must be done. So for me, when we look into matters of leadership, we basically needing to be able to distinguish it in this manner, that says leadership has to do with knowing what to do and why to do it. And too often what we're finding is that people are relating how to do things, and they call that leadership. And I call that management.
Right.
Because somebody has worked out the parameters, has worked out what needs to be done, and then people respond and work in that space. So what we're failing to be able to find in our country and much of the continent is people who are willing to be able to articulate what must be done and why it must be done.
There's an old discussion about whether leaders are born or are made. Where do we find the leaders? Are they born, or is there a way of cultivating leaders?
I always say it's both, of course, because nobody shows up on earth without having been born. But of course, I understand that question comes in the sense of saying, is it innate? Is it something that somebody is born with? Truth is, leadership, while we have it in business schools, we teach on leadership because we believe that people can be taught how to lead. And they do that by observing. And when we are able to articulate various case studies of people who have provided leadership and got others to be able to fall in line with them, then we know that we've got leadership that has been, in a sense, molded properly.
Polished and refined to a level.
Absolutely. And if I may also indicate, we do not really get to know leaders until there is a crisis. Fair weather leaders are never real leaders. They can talk theory. When there is a crisis, that's when you see the real credibility of the person, the gravitas, the values that drive them, the principles that govern them.
History's littered with a number of examples where there's crisis and leadership has stood up and risen to the occasion.
Absolutely.
If you can take us some of your highlighted case studies.
I've often looked into our own country, in South Africa in particular, that many people will be looking into. In 2 weeks' time, we'll be celebrating 21 years of freedom, as it were, the opportunity for us to make the cross and say we are choosing leadership. But the truth be told is that Nelson Mandela became president of the country in 1993, before we voted, because there was an incident that took place. We had Bishop, it was burning. We had Boy Patong, they were burning. And right there and there, it became very clear that the government of the time no longer had the credibility to be able to even rein in the military, to be able to get them to move away from mowing down population. When he stood up and spoke to what needed to be done and helped people to be able to see these are fellow South Africans like you are, changed everything. That's one example that we could be looking into. We've had instances that have taken place. Unfortunately, now we're having a lot of flaring up all around the country, as it were. But if you look back to some of the activities that took place pre-1990 out in the townships, in the hostels, leadership came there when they were able to, again, articulate what the future could be like. And when we kill one another, we're actually making it impossible for anybody to live into that future. So that becomes critical. Most of the people who have looked into the world stories begin to look back to 9/11, 2001, and say leadership emerged at that point, because when those towers came tumbling down, suddenly there was somebody who stood out and marshaled people, not only from New York City, but also around other states within the US. That, to me, speaks to leadership.
Leadership theory, there's one side that says leaders are individuals that stand up to the occasion, but then there's also a growing narrative around collective leadership. So is leadership an individual?
As you look into it, leaders are individual. Leadership is shared. You experience leadership. You don't do leadership. So I am somebody who is a student of leadership, and I observe how people have helped others to be able to move. Mrs. Carter, she was the first lady in the US, she said something very fundamental around the issue of leadership. She spoke to the fact that a good leader takes people to where they want to go to. A great leader takes people to where they don't necessarily want to go to, but ought to. Now, that to me created the shift.
Interesting points. Buyani, thank you so much for your time.
It's an absolute pleasure, Kgosi.